YouTube world. If you missed us a few weeks ago, I'm Alaina and this is Zoe, and this is our kickoff episode of Watch Girls A to Z. If you haven't already checked out our Instagrams, please do. I'm Alaina underscore A Watch Girl. I just completely messed that up. Anyway, I'm Watch Girl underscore A, and this is Watch Girl underscore Z. Please check us out on Instagram.
First off, we wanted to thank everyone for the positive feedback that we got from our first show with Tim last Monday. We got a lot of great suggestions and ideas and questions, and it was actually overwhelmingly about size, so we thought it would make sense for today's segment to be properly titled, Does Size Matter? So let's get into it.
Please remember, this is a really nerve-wracking thing if you've never been on TV. Bear with us, but we're really excited to have you all here. We're really excited to talk watches, answer your questions, and as Zoe mentioned, we got tons of questions about, what sizes fit women, what sizes fit men, what sizes wear bigger, smaller, and we're really excited to discuss it tonight. So in the Tim tradition, we wanted to start out and talk about what watches we're wearing tonight. Zoe, what do you have on?
So tonight I have on a watch that was handed down to me from my dad, who previously had it handed down to him by his father, my grandfather, and then his father, which is my great-grandfather. It's a Patek Philippe reference 2431. It was gifted to my great-grandfather for his 25th wedding anniversary for my great-grandmother. And it really should have gone to my brother, who's older than me, but I had my eye on it for a long time, so I got to wear it tonight.
Tonight, with the theme of size, I'm wearing a watch that's a 42 millimeter of Vacheron Dual Time, a watch I've always loved and admired. Not only is the finishing incredible on it, but the complications are really cool. There's a day-night, a power reserve, date, sweeping seconds. It's a pretty cool watch, and as you can see, the finishing is really stunning. Before we get started tonight, I want to say hi to everybody that's watching us. Tons of people making, saying hello. We have somebody from Chile, Park09, RJ86, Watch Yoda, CQ Gottlieb, Tom P, Don Grizzle. Thank you guys all for tuning in. Again, we're really excited to be here.
So bringing it back to the topic, I think where we should start is definitely the beginning of wristwatches was really in the early 1900s, after pocket watches became a little inconvenient for what was going on in the world. So we had World War I and a lot of aviation. So basically what happened was one of the first pilot watches was actually not what you would immediately think of. So when you think of a a pilot's watch, you think of a very round, large case size. And actually, funny enough, the first pilot's watch was probably on trend for sizing today. It was actually designed by Cartier for a friend who was a Brazilian pilot, and instead of having the inconvenience of going into his pocket and pulling out his pocket watch to see the time, he wanted something that he could just look at on his wrist as he was flying. So the watch that they created was a square shape Cartier Santos Dumont, and like I said, it's just not what you think of when you think of a pilot's watch, but it is in fact the first pilot's watch. It's what started pilot's watches. So then from there you have a lot of pretty, I would say, watches that you would definitely think of when you think of pilot's watches. For example, the Longines Lindbergh that was designed by Charles Lindbergh, who is a very famous pilot. That was designed in 1931 with a 47 millimeter case. So you're going from one spectrum to the other. And I think it's important to say that, yes, there were, in the early 1900s, there were a lot of pilot's watches with large case size. You also have dressier watches, such as a Patek 96 that had a 30.5 millimeter case size. So you really have full spectrum. But I would say the average for a dressier watch when it comes to vintage would be 28 millimeters to 32 millimeters, which now today is really considered a ladies' watch. Now, that's lucky for me. I'm a huge vintage fan, so I get more watches than any other man who would think that a 32 millimeter case size would be too small. I get to take advantage of that because it would fit very nicely on my wrist. And then as time went by, you saw 34 millimeter, 35 millimeter, and then Rolex really paved the way with 36 millimeter Datejust, and then everyone kind of followed suit with that. And it's funny, I had someone give me a call and talk to me and ask my opinion on which Datejust should they buy. They typically wear watches that are 40 millimeters, and he was interested in either getting a 36 millimeter or 41 millimeter Datejust. And I told him that obviously it's a personal preference. My thing about Datejust is you gotta go classic. The 36 millimeter is classic, classic, classic. 41 is definitely more on trend, but to go a little different from a 40 millimeter to a 36 millimeter, I think it's gonna take a little adjustment to see that on your wrist and think, you may think it's small, but you'll get used to it and love it.
So I think one of the interesting things when you think about watch sizes is not only the diameter of a watch, but there's also the thickness of a watch. And a lot of times that plays a huge effect into whether or not the watch will fit you. So we get tons of questions in the store and on the phones and emails about whether or not a watch is going to fit somebody's wrist. And it's an almost impossible question to answer when you don't have a wrist and a watch together. One thing I'd say to take into consideration is the thickness, as I mentioned. So I think back, to the history of watches and when they launched the Royal Oak back in the 1970s. And at that moment, the watch was a 39 millimeter, which is actually a pretty big watch. And for those of you that wear APs or have tried on APs, the way the lugs are set and the way the bracelet is integrated, they often wear almost bigger because it hangs off the side of your wrist a little differently than some other watches. I'd say actually, the Vacheron that I'm wearing is kind of similar. You can see how the bracelet integrates into the lugs, and although the diameter across may be a good fit for a lot of people, the lugs often don't fit. It's the same with JLC Reverso. It can often hang off the wrist in an incorrect way. So when you're looking at watches and you're thinking about size, I would also really think about the diameter. We've seen, I would say, the watch sizes have been pretty consistent over the last few years. In 2012, Zenith released a Type 20 that was like 57.5 millimeters, gigantic. In my little time in the industry, I haven't seen anything get much bigger than that. And I think we're starting to see things size down, but they've been pretty consistent in, I'd say, like the 40, 45 millimeters. What I do think we're starting to see is brands go for kind of thinner movements, more complications. Anybody can fit a movement into a big case, but building a thin movement is a much more complicated and interesting topic, I would say. So, we've seen a couple brands in the last couple of years release thinner movements, one of them being the Panerai Duet. Panerai released it last year, I believe, and they've been hugely well received. We do great with them in the store. If you haven't tried one on, it makes all the difference with a brand like Panerai. They are known for their big case sizes, so to get a thin movement makes a big difference. You can finally wear them with your suits and with your dress sleeves and your cuffs, and it fits under really nicely. I think it's what's going to end up setting brands apart is brands that can go with thinner movements. All the brands since the ETA has become unavailable have started to move towards in-house movements, and they've put millions of dollars into development and QC for these movements. And there's a lot of really cool ones out there. For example, the Planet Oceans that Omega's released. Amazingly cool designs, funky patterns, colors, straps, whatnot, but they're really thick. And so, you're paying the money and getting an awesome movement, but in regards to wearability, it's a tough piece because it won't fit under your suit and it doesn't fit under your sleeve. So when you're thinking about does size matter, don't only think about the case size, but definitely think about the thickness of a watch. Just while we have access to watches, I did bring those two watches in just so you guys could take a look at the difference between the cases and what a difference it does make. So we have the new Panerai Due. I mean, this is an outrageously beautiful watch, so uber thin, and of course in-house, which is a huge accomplishment for many brands, even in this day and age. Then you look at something like this Omega, which also is a stunningly beautiful watch, but the case is just, it's huge. And for everybody, although, you know, the diameter of the cases is not hugely different, it makes all of the difference when you're trying on something.
So we actually just got a question from Mr. Dapper. He says, what do you think of an Omega Aquaterra 38.5 millimeters versus 41 for a man's wrist? Do you think it still has a good presence?
Absolutely. I think that's an awesome watch for a man. Again, I think some of the Planet Oceans get so large. The Aquaterra, you get sort of a similar feel. You get the sporty look, but definitely more streamlined and a little bit thinner.
I agree. I think, as you mentioned before, that brands are starting to go a little bit smaller, thinner, a little more delicate on the wrist, but still have a nice presence. And 38.5 versus 41 doesn't make a huge difference, but it does give a different appearance in style. So I do think size matters.
Yeah, you know what? I think it's interesting too. It's really not that different for men and women. We got tons of questions about, you know, what should women wear, what should men wear? Do ladies like to wear men's watches? Yeah, of course we love to wear men's watches. But there's something to be said about a smaller watch, especially when it comes down for dress. And I think a lot of men can relate to this. I see a lot of comments popping up about wearing 35 millimeters and whatnot, which is perfectly fine and suited to a man, nothing wrong with it. I think for dressier watches, smaller is better. Zoe and I have been talking a lot this week about the re-release of the Cartier Panther, which, you know, is an 80s watch. I know my mom always loved that watch, and she has, you know, I borrowed one for my sister's wedding and she tried to snag it from me. I think people are really excited about the re-release of the Panther, which is, in this day and age, is a smaller watch, but we've seen a lot of success with it so far.
Yeah, so once it was, or there was talk of it being released, I actually saw an influx of Cartier Panthers on the secondary market. There were a lot on eBay, a lot on Chrono24, and a lot came my way being offered for us to purchase. And it was really interesting. I had one client who had this Cartier Panther for 20 plus years, and it was the 22 by 30, so it was the smallest one that they produced, and she wanted to trade it in towards a modern piece just to get a newer piece. And at first she was going to trade it in towards the same size, and when she got to the store she decided to go with the medium piece. So it was really interesting to see that she was trading up towards a slightly larger piece.
Yeah. We'd be interested to hear about how you feel about case sizes. You know, some people are really stuck on wearing, you know, 45s and bigger. Would you wear a smaller watch for a dress watch? Do you like to wear big watches? Is it, you know, when you're going out to dinner, you'd wear something certain, or when you're going out to play sports, you want a bigger watch? If you can shoot us some comments and some questions, we would be happy to answer them. We've also gotten a ton of questions since we appeared on Tim's show a couple weeks ago, and we'd love to dive into them and answer a few of the questions for you guys.
So before you delve into that, someone just asked if a ceramic sub is too large for daily wear on a 6 1/4 inch wrist. So I actually have a little bit, my wrist is a little bit smaller than 6 inches. I would totally rock a sub. Whenever I get one in my hands, I try it on, I take pictures of it, I love it. Even more so with a slightly bigger wrist. I think it's a great size, definitely manageable, it's not too large, and you're definitely going to see women start to rock 40 millimeters a lot more. We actually I had a client call in today, he's buying a watch for his wife, and one of the watches that he was interested in was a Lady Diver, a Ulysse Nardin Lady Diver, which was 40 millimeters. Automatic watch. Very interesting that UN is kind of tuning into mechanical watches for women with a larger case size. And the other watch that he was interested in purchasing for his wife was a Marine Diver, also 40 millimeters. And I was looking at the two and trying to give my honest opinion. I do think for a lady, the lady diver is just a bit more feminine and would probably wear it a little bit better. Even though they're both 40 millimeters, there is something to say about the color of the bezel and how it affects the size of the dial and how it would look on the wrist. And I asked Alaina what she thought, and we had contrasting opinions.
Like usual.
Like usual. But if they could show the picture of the two UNs, I would love to see comments on what people think looks larger.
Oh, there it is, up on the corner over there.
So it's up in the corner. I would love to see everyone's opinions on which looks bigger on my wrist. So it's my wrist. They're both 40 millimeters, but I do think one has a bigger appearance than the other. Alaina says the marine diver on the right side. I say the men's watch on the right, and Alaina says on the left. So let's see.
Like usual with dials, colors, and bezels, obviously you get optical illusions. To me, when I look at that lady diver, the bezel, blends in with the dial, which to my eye makes it look like it's a much bigger watch. But again, it's all in the eye of the beholder, and people see things differently and people wear things differently. It's interesting because one of the first questions we actually got, will 40 stand the test of time for women? I'm seeing a lot of comments pop up here about trends and things going in and out. I think 40 is probably a little large to stand the test of time. I think 36 is probably what will stay consistent. When you look at what my mom used to wear, she used to wear, I think, a 26 millimeter, which is really small, but 36 I think is where it will probably, that's the size.
Yep, and someone just asked if we think the vintage craze will continue for a long time or fade in the next couple of years. I don't think it's going anywhere. If anything, it's going to get stronger. You're going to find less in great condition. You're going to find less with a full set that it originally came with, and that only adds value to the watches and make them more special. So as time goes on and watches are traded, I do think vintage is just the value on Rolex and Patek in particular are just going to keep getting stronger. And sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just going to add that, we've seen a lot of watch brands in the last few years do remakes on vintage pieces. Oris has done some. A lot of different brands reinvent. I mean, the Panther, again, a vintage watch coming back into the market. I think vintage will always be there. It's kind of an interesting thing to think about and probably a topic for another day. But we did have somebody ask us the other day what kind of watches, contemporary watches will stand the test of time over years and what will, be the classic watches in the next generations coming up, which is definitely an interesting topic. Again, we'd love to hear your feedback on that and definitely a topic for another day.
Another gentleman called in and asked our opinion on 42 millimeter Panerai. He saw that you were wearing one in the last show. It's him.
Pan 512.
And he is of a smaller stature. He said he's 5'7", has a very small wrist, but loves Panerai. And he's a little self-conscious that it just overtakes his wrist and looks a little ridiculous. And maybe in comparison from the watch to the wrist, it just makes him look smaller. What's your opinion on that?
I think it's actually the perfect time to bring back the Duet. This is the watch for, the smaller wristed men and women out there who want to wear a Panerai. I agree that, it's sort of like this watch on my wrist right now. It's questionable whether or not it's a good size. It's a little thick, I think. It hangs off a little. Do I feel comfortable rocking it? Absolutely. I think, again, it has to do with the fact that the bracelet is fitted correctly and it's not flopping over my wrist. But when it comes down to being nervous about wearing a big watch, I think something like this would be a great option for him.
Yeah, and I think it goes a long way saying that it's the man who wears the watch and the watch doesn't wear the man. So if you want to rock that Panerai, rock that Panerai. I also brought in a very special piece, one that we took in very recently. It's a Patek Philippe reference 3940 in platinum. It's an EP, which means that it has a waterproof case. In earlier editions, it was just a 3970p, but when they added a solid case back, it became waterproof, so they added the E, which I can't speak French very fluently, so I can't pronounce it, but it means waterproof in French. What's special about this piece is it's the successor to the 2499, which is a very highly praised grand complication for Patek. This is a perpetual calendar chronograph, and what's really special about it is in platinum, what you usually see is a black dial with diamond markers, which you would think would be a little more rare, but you really don't see the silver dial that much. I picked this piece to show everyone just because it's a 36 millimeter watch, but I think it definitely delivers on presence on the wrist. So even though 36 millimeter is kind of looked at as small on the smaller side, it has a great presence on your wrist.
A good segue, talking about Patek, there's a few questions up here about what we think about the Nautilus line for women. It is an absolutely fabulous line for women. I mean, everything Patek does is pretty amazing, but the Nautilus line in particular, I happen to think is the right mix of luxury and sport and all those good things you want on a wrist. The 5711, I think, is an ideal watch. A 5711 Rose would be like a grill for me. What do you think about the Nautilus line?
It's one of my dream watches. I hope to one day have a vintage piece in my collection. It's not going to be attainable for a very long time, but it's definitely up there on my list of watches that will have to be. It's not even a question. It will need to be in my collection one day.
I think we actually have two really cool vintage pieces. I wish we had brought them for sale right now. I think they're yellow gold. So if you haven't checked them out, check out our website. We do have some cool vintage Nautilus up there.
Yeah, we also have a stainless steel 3800, which is very cool. It's a smaller case, so that would be great for anyone who has a smaller wrist. And yeah, so I think we're heading towards the end of our show, and again, we want to answer some questions of our viewers. Someone that asked us last week was curious to see if we're seeing our female clients buying more men's or ladies' pieces today.
I would say most of the women that I have calling and buying themselves watches or buying men's watches. There seems to be a lot of Daytonas, some Panerais out there. Yeah, I see a lot of women coming in and buying men's watches. Now, it seems to me that a lot of times when men buy watches, they're buying women's watches for women. Again, I don't know if it's just, the marketing out there, but a lot of 24s and that kind of thing when the men come in to buy it, and then women seem to buy themselves men's watches.
So Barry Kaufman just asked, what's the website? The website where all of our pre-owned inventory is govbergwatches.com. There you'll see we have over 1,500 pre-owned pieces. You'll also see the brands that we carry new as an authorized dealer. We also have an app called Watchbox where you can shop. You can also add your collection of your watches and get values for it. It's a really, really great and helpful app, so definitely suggest downloading that. Now, some of the questions that we're getting, or actually to feed off that last question, do you see men who are buying watches for their female significant others? Are they buying men's watches for them, or are they buying ladies' watches for them?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I think most men come in and they're buying women's watches for women. As I mentioned, a lot of 24s, we see a lot of diamond pieces, some rose gold APs with diamond bezels, a lot of Rolex. It's often hard to define what makes a man's watch versus a woman's watch. Like, is a 36 millimeter Datejust with diamonds a men's watch, or is it a woman's watch? Technically, it's really a unisex watch. To me, when you put the diamonds, I think it becomes a little bit more feminine, although there is nothing wrong with men wearing diamonds.
So we got a really great question from Clive. He said, if you two were sharing an elevator ride of watch CEOs, what is one thing you'd tell them?
To make some watches that fit women, that are, shaped and designed for women, that don't have diamonds on them. There are so many watches I can think of that I would absolutely love if it didn't have a diamond bezel, because that's not what I'm looking for my everyday watch.
Agreed. I would also ask Patek if the Patek 24 is designed to be worn 24 hours in a day, why not create an automatic one? It's quartz. Some women like mechanical watches, and again, if they're marketing it as a watch that could be worn 24 hours a day, doesn't that mean that it should be automatic? And I don't know. That's probably what I would ask.
Yeah. A lot of
That's a really good
questions
question.
and comments for them.
Yeah, lots of good questions and comments for CEOs of watch brands.
Just reading through our questions here.
So many questions, so many great comments. Let's see. So case diameter and lug to lug is often referenced in size, but what about case thickness? Is there a range, or is it dependent on the case diameter?
Again, I think it goes back to what I was talking about earlier in the show, that when you pick up a watch and you start looking at the size and trying to figure out if it fits, the case thickness is really important. I think, again, these two watches sitting here on the table are a great example of how different the thickness is. Case diameter does not determine thickness. Obviously, the movement that's inside and oftentimes the amount of complications will determine how thick the watch really is. So they don't go hand in hand always. Any other questions on here?
Well, this has been fun. I think we'll probably end it here. We're on the show. We have our own show, Watch Girls A to Z, every other Thursday, rotating with the wonderful Mike Michaels and Tim. Again, if you have questions, comments, suggestions, please reach out to us. We would love to hear from you and get some feedback. And obviously, we want to answer anything that you'd like to know. So
yeah, and no matter how silly the question, obviously Tim is one of the most knowledgeable people out there, probably in the whole world when it comes to watches. Mike Michaels as well, as a watchmaker, knows the ins and outs. Zoe and I are here to kind of answer any of those questions you might have. Being in sales and having worked for Gottberg, we're super interested in helping, the new collectors out there answer questions that they may be too embarrassed to ask when they walk into the Omega boutique or, another store somewhere. So feel free to shoot us questions all week long. We check it all the time. We're really excited to be here, and we can't wait for some future episodes and some future chats and working with you all. So thanks again for tuning in.
Thanks, guys.